Water, natural beauty, climate, opportunity. The same irresistible qualities that we appreciate in Sarasota County today have appealed to people for thousands of years. It may be difficult to imagine those earlier times as our cars whisk past modern office buildings, condominiums, and shopping malls. Still, many images of Sarasota County's rich heritage remain, preserved in historic and archaeological sites and natural wonders, saved for future generations. These reflections of the community's past tell a story of Native people, pioneers, entrepreneurs, and artists who called Sarasota County home and shaped the community we know today, a place described as unique and special. Native Americans inhabited Florida at least 10,000 years ago. The land was wider, drier, and cooler, covered with prairie-like vegetation. Archaeologist Marian Almy.
Most Floridians today are from other states and other places. They're surprised to find out that Florida's been inhabited since about 10,000 years ago. It was just at the end of the last ice age. The ice was still locked up in the ice sheets of North America.
The Everglades, rivers, creeks, ponds, and swamps we associate with the Sunshine State did not exist.
Florida had sinkholes, cenotes perhaps, springs, and that's where the water was. For example, in the Myakka River in East Sarasota County, there's a place called Deep Hole. And Deep Hole is a deep hole, and that may have had an early spring in it.
The Myakka River is just one of the places where Paleo Indians lived. Warm mineral springs and little salt springs in the southern part of Sarasota County preserve important evidence of prehistoric human life.
There's evidence of the oldest human burial in eastern North America was excavated in the early 1970s from warm mineral springs. 8,000 years ago, they were cave-like environments, and early man and early animals congregated around these water sources.
Today, Warm Mineral Springs, a health retreat with refreshing, continuously flowing water, is a National Register of Historic Places archaeological site. Archaeologists say evidence left behind in this region 5,000 years ago during the Archaic period speaks volumes about its terrain, animals, and inhabitants.
We have the environment we have today in Florida. Sea level rose, rivers and creeks rose, and mangroves began to grow. The Indians hunted and fished, perhaps seasonally, moving into the Myakka River Valley, maybe hunting deer in the fall when the nuts for the acorns were falling. The deer followed the falling acorns, and the Indians followed the deer.
Shell middens found throughout Sarasota County reveal stories about the lifestyle, survival skills, and determination of these early inhabitants. Almy stands in the cutaway of a midden preserved at historic Spanish Point. It's listed in the National Register of Historic Places.
They ate shellfish and fish, possum, raccoon, deer, all kinds of birds. Huge shell middens grew up. If you think about shucking oysters, having oysters on the half shell, you know what it looks like when you finished a great dinner. There's just a pile of stuff. And so the Indians piled this up.
Middens and burial mounds can be found near areas where there was an abundant supply of water and food, from Indian Beach to Manasota Key, Spanish Point to Myakka.
There's almost no place in Sarasota County that doesn't have evidence of our Native Americans. And the Native Americans could live on the best land there was because they had the pick of the land.
The vibrant cultures of Florida's Native Americans were lost forever as European explorers began the campaign to conquer the New World. They brought diseases with them: measles, mumps, chickenpox, smallpox, to which the Native Americans had no immunity. By the early 1700s, the few who survived disease were enslaved. Some migrated away, and others converted to Catholicism, ensuring their freedom.
A society that had existed in the southeastern United States and Florida for over 10,000 years just crumbled and fell apart. It was a disastrous end to a once marvelous, marvelous culture.
As Florida's Native Americans died out, other tribes, primarily the Creek and Miccosukee from the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama, were driven into the peninsula by expanding European settlement. They collectively became known by whites as the Seminoles. Runaway slaves and free blacks often joined the Seminoles or created their own settlements. Florida's Peace River Frontier describes one such community. Fleeing conflicts of the War of 1812, they settled in the Sarasota Bay area. The region from Tampa Bay to Charlotte Harbor, including Sarasota Bay, had a reputation as a haven for blacks. A substantial farming settlement prospered for several years until it was destroyed by military forces whose mission was to capture runaway slaves. In an ongoing effort to remove Seminoles from Florida, the United States fought 3 Seminole Wars. The military established Fort Armistead in 1841 on the shores of Sarasota Bay, near present-day Indian Beach. The journal entry of a soldier describes conditions at Fort Armistead.
The encampment has 600 soldiers. 100 Seminoles awaiting deportation. Living conditions are difficult. Some soldiers are suffering from fever and dysentery.
The fort was abandoned after just 1 season. In 1842, Congress passed the Armed Occupation Act to encourage settlement on frontier lands. But there was a catch. The new title holders had to stay 5 years and fight off any others who claimed the land.
It was occupied by Spanish fishermen who were not citizens. It was occupied by Seminoles who had no rights whatsoever, and the slaves who lived with them who had no rights whatsoever.
Dr. Janet Snyder Matthews, Florida's State Historic Preservation Officer, describes the first white settlers in Sarasota County. Matthews is at the restored Guptill House at historic Spanish Point, where one of the early pioneer families settled.
They were primarily Tallahassee people, entrepreneurial people with slaves. William Whitaker and his brother, Hamlin Snell. Snell was a territorial legislator and a lawyer, were the first people to come as American settlers onto Spanish fishery sites.
Whitaker crossed the Manatee River in 1843 and set up his homestead on Yellow Bluffs overlooking Sarasota Bay. His home was near the bayou that bears his name.
Cattle is a really important part of this story. Whereas the Whitakers had cattle, citrus, the cattle industry was one of the largest industries.
In the 1850s, other cattlemen moved to Florida. They joined William Whitaker to run herds in the Myakka River. According to family history, one day while riding the cattle range, Whitaker heard a noise in the thick bush. It was a young runaway slave from North Carolina named Jeffrey Bolding. The Whitakers took care of Bolding, then purchased him. Like many slaves, he remained with his former owners well after the Emancipation Proclamation made him a free man. At the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, 50 years of conflict in Florida finally ended, opening the way for more settlement in the state. Jesse Knight moved his family and cattle herd from Hillsborough County. In 1868, he settled into an area known as Horse and Chase. 20 years later, it became known as Venice.
The Knight family, becoming the southernmost neighbors for the Webb family, were people they knew really well, and they were Florida crackers of many, many generations. And they picked Venice just because everybody around hoped that this water area would become like Venezia in Italy.
The community of Old Myakka predates the Civil War and has its origins in cattle ranching. John Crowley arrived in the 1880s. He played a significant role in the development of the community as a farmer, cattleman, and blacksmith. The Methodist Church, built in 1886, is still used by worshipers today. It's a prime example of how ongoing stewardship and care by community residents protect historic structures and keep them in use. On Little Sarasota Bay, another family established their homestead. John and Eliza Webb left New York in 1867 for a healthier climate. They found it on a midden overlooking the bay. The Webbs called their new home Spanish Point.
They had a family of grown children, a labor force, and they knew how to plant crops, and of course their transportation was the water. The waterway was their I-75.
The Webbs had their own citrus packing plant and shipped citrus and vegetables on their own schooners to Key West and Cedar Key. To supplement their income, they took in boarders at what they called the Webb Winter Resort, the beginning of Sarasota County's tourism industry. Historic Spanish Point was the first site in Sarasota County listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Other pioneer families settled mostly along the coasts of Sarasota and Little Sarasota Bays, Lemon Bay, the bayous and creeks that flowed into them. The reason? There were no real roads. boats were the chief mode of transportation for people and supplies. These early pioneers were captivated by the beauty of the coast, the bays, and the climate. It was a beautiful place, but a rugged life. Eliza Webb, April 5, 1868.
How I wish you were here today so that I could talk to you about our beautiful country instead of writing about it. We think we shall never see frost here, although a fire is very comfortable and very pleasant in a winter evening. And in the summer, there are only 2 or 3 hours in the day in which we have not a nice land or sea breeze. The wind blows from the land in the morning and from the Gulf in the afternoon. In fact, I can't conceive a finer climate than this.
In 1885, a group of colonists, mostly from Scotland, arrived in Sarasota. They were promised a new life in an idyllic place. Based on information from the Florida Mortgage and Investment Company, the Scots expected a city with paved streets, housing, stores, and other amenities. The Sarasota they found wasn't at all what they expected. One of the colonists, Alex Browning, wrote in his memoirs,
"It was late in the afternoon when we landed at last, arriving at our destination, Sarasota, where we were met by the other colonists as well as all the other natives for miles around, including the Whitakers, Riggins, Abbeys, Tuckers, and Tatums. Of course, there was much discontent being dumped like this in a wild country without houses to live in, tired and hungry. One can imagine what it was like."
Within a few months, most of the Scottish colonists left Sarasota angry and disappointed. Most settled in more established communities, and some returned to Scotland. To protect company interests, the mortgage company sent John Hamilton Gillespie to Sarasota. In 1886, Gillespie began developing a town. He built the DeSoto Hotel for visitors, a golf course for their enjoyment, and the first railroad. The railroad had originally been planned to run from Lakeland to Boca Grande. Only 9 miles of track was laid from Bradenton to Sarasota when rail service began in 1892. Locals nicknamed the railroad the Slow and Wobbly. It lasted only a year, but that was long enough.
Soon the train was weaving through the woods, rattling and squeaking its winding way between ditches, excavated to raise the narrow gauge track above the ordinary level of the woods. This had settled in many places, making it rough riding.
In 1902, Sarasota incorporated as a town. Gillespie was elected mayor. Amenities such as an electric power plant and ice plant were introduced. In 1903, 10 years after the Slow and Wobbly stopped operating, the Seaboard Airline Railway was built, connecting Sarasota to Tampa and the nation. Now, newcomers had another way to travel to Sarasota County, and people here had another way to ship goods north. The train's tracks ended on a pier where fish and produce could be loaded easily. At the same time whites settled in, a new African-American community was beginning. Lewis Colson played a pivotal role in the development of Overtown. Colson was an axeman with Richard Paulson's surveying party in 1884. They came to plat the community that became the town of Sarasota. Colson and his wife Irene, possibly the couple in this unlabeled Felix Pinard photograph, purchased land in 1897. They donated a lot for the Bethlehem Baptist Church, only the second church building in the town of Sarasota. Colson was the pastor from 1899 until 1918. Leonard Reed arrived in Overtown in 1900. Historian Linda Turner is standing in front of Reed's home that has been rehabilitated and preserved. The house is listed in the City of Sarasota's local register of historic places.
In the late 40s, I can remember Leonard Reed. He was he was just a gentleman. Take the hat off, open the door. He was always so correct, the way he walked, just the way he carried himself.
Reed was hired by John Gillespie as coachman, confidant, and later the greenskeeper at his golf course. In her book, Once Upon a Morning, Neil Chapline recalls meeting Reed and remembers the relationship between Leonard Reed and Colonel Gillespie.
The colonel and his wife took Leonard into their home. Leonard became the constant companion and helper of the colonel. Intelligent, ambitious, with an inward pride that matched the colonel's own, Leonard learned the art of being a gentleman's gentleman.
Colonel Gillespie was more than just Leonard's employer. He was his friend, advisor. You know, in the black community, you have leaders. He was a very positive leader.
In the southern part of town, a visionary named Harry Heigl set his sights on developing an island known by several names: Clam Island, Mussel Island, and Little Sarasota Key. Heigl was active in the business community, served as mayor, and operated his own steamship service between Tampa and Sarasota. He began promoting the idea of an idyllic beach development. In 1907, along with two business associates, Heigl platted a subdivision on the north end of the key called Siesta on the Gulf. Gradually, locals began calling the entire island Siesta Key. Heigl, hoping to lure newcomers and tourists to the key, promoted it this way.
A haven of rest where the waves of water from Big Sarasota Pass lap on the long, white, clean beaches. Where the Gulf breezes blow, purifying and refreshing. Where in the beautiful tropical growth of the island you can lose yourself in the rapture of thought and the inspiration of soul.
The island paradise Heigl envisioned was accessible only by boat until 1917, when a bridge over the bay opened. On another barrier island to the south, Carl Johansson planned his own beach retreat. Johansson, who lived on the mainland in Englewood, built one of the earliest homes on Manasota Key in 1907. He called it the Hermitage. Listed both in the National and Sarasota County Registers of Historic Places, the building has been rehabilitated to serve as an artist retreat. In addition to real estate and tourism, agriculture and cattle ranching continued to expand in Sarasota County. Another industry that emerged was the production of turpentine. Sandra Terry.
My grandfather came here, and he was a foreman in the turpentine industry.
In the inland areas, the trees of pine flatwoods were tapped for sap that was distilled into turpentine. When the trees tapped out, they were harvested for lumber. A small community between Venice and Sarasota became a center for these industries. The town was called Laurel. At the rehabilitated Johnson Chapel, a National Register of Historic Places building, longtime resident Sandra Terry remembers.
The turpentine quarters, as it was called back then, was a complete community. It had a store, it had a school, it had a church, and it had lots of families who worked and led, regular lives.
The Florida real estate boom peaked in the mid-1920s. In Sarasota County, the arrival of Bertha Palmer in 1910 helped set the stage. As a woman, she was unique among the many entrepreneurs who would discover the lands of Florida were ripe for development. In Chicago, Bertha Palmer, the wealthy widow of businessman Potter Palmer, read an ad by J.H. Lord, an early Sarasota developer, boasting about Sarasota's beauty. Intrigued, she arrived with an entourage of family members. Palmer fell in love with the area and purchased a bayfront house, which she remodeled and named The Oaks. She also bought other lands of the Webb family homestead. Wrapped around prehistoric middens, many of Palmer's walkways, formal gardens, reflecting pools and paths are restored and preserved at historic Spanish Point. On the estate were boathouses, docks, an electric plant, a water system, several groves, poultry sheds, and a home farm. Palmer and her sons were savvy business people who knew how to expand their investments. From 1910 to 1917, they acquired some 90,000 acres of land in today's Sarasota County. Holdings extended to Bee Ridge, Vamo, Osprey, Venice, and along the Mayaca River. At her ranch, called Meadow Sweet Pastures, she pioneered many husbandry practices commonly employed today, including fencing with barbed wire and insect control through dipping in concrete vats to prevent tick fever. Population growth in the communities of Sarasota County dramatically increased. Several well-respected citizens who arrived in the decade shaped the destiny of boomtime Sarasota County. Notables such as Dr. Fred Albee, John and Charles Ringling, and Owen Burns. In 1914, the small town of Sarasota incorporated as a city. That same year, Charles C.N. Thompson, a civic and business leader in the white community, platted a new area for African Americans. At the time, blacks lived in Overtown on the fringe of downtown. They were encouraged to move to Newtown outside the existing city limits. Over the years, Newtown became a self-contained community with a post office, gas station, barber shop, grocery stores, and pharmacy. Overtown is a recent addition to the National Register of Historic Places.
Overtown grew up. In fact, the first blacks, in fact, this is where Jeffrey was, this is where Leonard Reed was, Louis Cosin. They all were in this area, right here in the Overtown area. And then when it grew and it bloomed and it blossomed, and they heard about it in 1914, the property in Newtown, this new subdivision. In fact, it was two words, new and town with the E on the end. And so they end up going to Newtown, buying property. And then when they started investing money over here in Newtown in 1914, some of them said, well, I can buy a lot for $200, and a lot of them invested money and moved over there. Overtown was still here, just didn't have as many people. And everybody was flourishing over in Newtown, and it was growing. So that's how the two got started.
Land travel was difficult. The sand roadways were vulnerable to flooding in the rainy season and to deep ruts at other times. In 1915, voters in Sarasota, Osprey, and Venice approved the $250,000 bond issue to connect the communities. Thick, impenetrable palmettos made road construction tough. However, the situation changed in 1917 when African-American inventor Henry C. Webb patented a cutting plow. It tackled the thick palmetto roots and trunks that covered Sarasota County. Using Webb's plow, workers cleared the way for the construction of a 9-foot-wide asphalt road. The Velvet Highway, as it was called, opened in 1918, making road travel between Sarasota and Venice smooth and easy. This road was later incorporated into the Tamiami Trail connecting Tampa and Miami. In the period from 1910 to 1921, as communities grew, several women's clubs were formed. At a time when communities were too small to support multiple cultural and civic organizations, women's clubs took the lead. Sarasota women instilled a sense of pride and weaved culture into the fabric of our county. Clubs were organized in Sarasota, Bee Ridge, Englewood, and Venice Nokomis. The club sponsored concerts, lectures, poetry readings, and after-school programs for children. All of the women's clubs started libraries, most of which eventually became part of the Sarasota County Library System. Both the Sarasota and Lemon Bay Women's Clubs are listed in the National and Sarasota County Registers of Historic Places. The Bee Ridge Women's Club is listed in the Sarasota County Register of Historic Places. Florida's great land boom of the 1920s was the crest of a wave that began at the end of World War I. In 1921, business leaders led a successful campaign to establish Sarasota as its own county, rather than a part of Manatee County. One of the leaders in real estate development was Owen Burns. He first visited Sarasota in 1910 on a fishing trip. Burns saw Sarasota's potential as much more than a fishing village. He bought land from Gillespie, becoming the largest landowner in the town of Sarasota. He founded the Board of Trade and the first locally owned bank, Citizens Bank. In addition, he founded Burns Realty and Burns Construction Company. To further Sarasota's allure as a resort destination, Burns built the upscale El Vernona Hotel, named for his wife. He developed a wide range of housing, from large homes to small starter bungalows, such as Burns Court. Listing the 15 Mediterranean Revival-style bungalows in the National Register of Historic Places served as a catalyst for the revitalization of the neighborhood. Burns was one of Sarasota's most innovative developers. In the 1920s, he teamed with circus magnate John Ringling, who had a winter home on Sarasota Bay. Together, they undertook expansive development projects.
And they formed a kind of not a real partnership, because there are no partner papers. Even for the circus, there is nothing. But they agreed that they had common interests, and John Ringling had the money to invest, and Owen Burns owned a realty company, a dredge and fill company, several other enterprises, which made him the most active local developer.
Owen Burns and John Ringling worked together to develop St. Armand's Key. Burns acquired the property in 1923. He sold it to Ringling in 1924, and together they created a development called John Ringling Estates. Their vision was to create a resort with hotels, golf courses, upscale shops, and a bathing pavilion. Burns Construction Company prepared the land, laid streets and sidewalks, and built the bridge and causeway connecting the key to the mainland. With great fanfare, the development opened in 1926. St. Armand's Key is listed in the National Register of Historic Places because of its planned landscape. While John Ringling developed on the Keys, his brother Charles Ringling focused on the mainland.
The kind of thing that interested him was not the elite metro resort that John and Burns envisioned, but he wanted to build for more ordinary people to have homes in the city.
As part of Charles' development efforts, he constructed the Sarasota Terrace Hotel in downtown Sarasota in 1925. He also provided land for the county courthouse designed by architect Dwight James Baum in the Mediterranean Revival style and listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The courthouse was completed in 1927 and was recently rehabilitated. Baum accepted the courthouse commission after completing the most ornate and unique structure built in Sarasota County, John and Mabel Ringling's home, Ca d'Zan. The restored Ca d'Zan is part of the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art. John Ringling saw the presence of a major art museum as an enduring cultural asset, which would enrich the Sarasota community. The collection of Renaissance and Baroque masterpieces reflects Ringling's personality. Upon his death in 1936, the museum was bequeathed to the state of Florida. The Ca d'Zan and Ringling Museum are both listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Many of the new residents of Sarasota County brought with them an appreciation for entertainment and for the arts. Sarasota's theater history began during the boom period. The Edwards Theater, built by civic leader A.B. Edwards, opened in 1926. Nationally recognized artists such as Will Rogers and the Ziegfeld Follies played there. The restored theater now serves as the Sarasota Opera House and is recognized both locally and nationally for its historical and architectural significance. Further south in Sarasota County, internationally renowned New York surgeon Dr. Fred Albee bought land in the Venice-Nokomis area. Before long, he owned almost 30 miles of Gulf and Bay property. In 1925, Albee hired eminent urban planner John Nolan to design the city of Venice. That same year, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, looking for a lucrative investment opportunity, purchased 30,000 acres from Albee. Historian Dorothy Corwick.
The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers was basically, it was a union, a pension fund for the railroad engineers, and a retirement fund, basically. It was a self-insured retirement fund. So they had lots of money.
The Brotherhood, one of the largest and richest unions in the country, retained Albee's city planner, Nolan. Under the direction of the organization, Nolan designed a balanced city with separate areas for commerce, industry, agriculture, and homes. The Brotherhood's plan included many parks and called for Northern Italian architectural design in all construction.
John Nolan essentially invented city planning in the United States. The profession did not exist before he came on the scene, and it was through his force of personality, his work ethic, that he really established planning, city planning, as a profession in the United States. If it weren't for the railroad, probably none of these people would have come, because there was no way to get here, literally.
The Brotherhood advertised the Venice area. The union operated a model farm that grew a variety of crops. They created a promotional brochure titled, "The Soil That Never Sleeps." The boom that caused the population to balloon in Sarasota County and the entire state was beginning to bust. Many say that the stock market crash in 1929 caused America's Great Depression, but the bust in Florida actually occurred much earlier. Financial backing for most of Florida developments dried up in 1926. Banks and businesses failed. The Brotherhood pulled out in 1929. Venice became a virtual ghost town. In the city of Sarasota, some construction projects stopped and were never completed, like John Ringling's dream of a Ritz-Carlton hotel on Longboat Key. Other grand plans remained on paper only, without the turning of a single shovel. Times were tough. There was no money. Even so, in the southernmost part of the county, another resort community was on the drawing board, Englewood, incorporated in 1925, began as a small fishing village on Lemon Bay and was settled by a few pioneer families. Larry Evans.
Fishing was the mainstay of this complete area. Tourism was a far second, I would say. And just about everybody in town that worked that wasn't a tourist from somewhere else was a fisherman.
The boom plan for Englewood called for a huge community center, a country club and a golf course, a beach casino with a swimming pool, and palm-lined 100-foot-wide boulevards throughout the town. There were even plans for a $6 million university and a 100-room hotel. Surveyors and real estate speculators swelled the town's population to 600. The town couldn't provide any municipal services, however, and in 1929 was unincorporated. Englewood returned to its roots as a fishing village. Evans remembers those days at a pier that he built as a teenager.
Even though it was Depression days, I could make quite a bit of money catching trout. I catch 100, 150 pounds of trout a day, and I was getting 5 and 6 cents a pound for them. So, you know, that equates to quite a bit of money for Depression days.
In Venice, hope for better days came in the form of an unexpected new member of the community. The Kentucky Military Institute chose Venice for its winter campus in 1932. The Hotel Venice, built during the boom, housed administrative offices, classrooms, and the library. Today, it is a retirement home, rehabilitated, and listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Another institution that provided support during the Depression was the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. In 1927, the County Commission gave John Ringling 160 acres of land at the county fairgrounds. The property became the winter quarters of the circus. The presence of the circus stimulated the local economy through jobs, support for businesses, and tourism.
There were probably 1,000 people who came, and the greatest benefit at first was the building of the facilities for the circus. That did bring a lot of money, and Mr. Ringley then was the largest employer here. The local paper said the circus did not cure the Depression, but it did make it more interesting.
During the Depression, the federal government created several agencies as part of President Roosevelt's New Deal. At Myakka River State Park, the Civilian Conservation Corps built cabins, roads and bridges, a pavilion, and planted trees. The park was developed on 27,000 acres, making it Florida's largest state park. It opened to the public in 1942. In the city of Sarasota, the Works Progress and the Public Works Administrations constructed Bayfront Park on 37 acres. The project included shuffleboard, lawn bowling, and tennis courts. The park's municipal auditorium is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The building and the beautiful hazard fountain in front are now rehabilitated. Another WPA project was the Lido Beach Casino. Architect Ralph Twitchell designed the casino, which housed 3 dining areas, a pool, lockers, showers, and cabanas. Twitchell's plan was influenced by the design philosophy of Frank Lloyd Wright. The building was a concrete structure with large seahorse columns. It was painted in tropical shades. The casino opened to the public in 1940 and was the scene of swimming and diving competitions, beauty pageants, dances, and fashion shows until its demolition in 1969. In 1941, the United States joined World War II. Army airfields and bases were established throughout Florida for the training of pilots and soldiers. Like the rest of the state, the Army air bases in the cities of Sarasota and Venice introduced thousands of servicemen to the area and boosted the economy. After the war, many servicemen returned to make Sarasota County their home. The beauty, the color of the Gulf and Bay, the quality of natural light, and a welcoming cultural climate attracted architects, authors, and artists. Architecture played an important role in Sarasota's post-war development. Young modernist architects were drawn to a community open to artistic experimentation. Paul Rudolph, a young Harvard-trained architect, joined architect Ralph Twitchell's firm. Rudolph and Twitchell were key leaders of the modern movement that became known as the Sarasota School of Architecture. The new style was a dramatic departure from the Mediterranean revival theme that dominated the boom period. Architect Tim Siebert describes the new method he used to design the Dickerson House. It was recently rehabilitated and is listed in the Sarasota County Register of Historic Places.
And it's about, among other things, visual extension. If you sit in this house, you're never quite sure where the house ends and the outdoors begins. We also learned to use everyday materials. In this particular part of the world, we took plywood and concrete block and ordinary things and made architecture out of them.
Architecture is just one dimension of Sarasota County's cultural heritage. Authors who were drawn to the area included novelist McKinley Cantor, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel Andersonville, and John D. MacDonald, best known for the Travis McGee mystery novels. There has been wide community interest in the visual arts since John Ringling opened his Museum of Art in 1930 and started an art school that became the Ringling School of Art and Design. Artist Tilton Leach came to Sarasota in 1931 to teach at the Ringling School. 16 years later, Leach and his wife opened their own art school in Sarasota.
The whole town was really built on art. John Ringling was the first one who came here and gave that wonderful museum to the state, which also attracted many artists to come here. So the whole economic impact of the arts was very important during the early years that we were. And even developers used art. They always had art shows at their new condominiums, and the banks used art.
Sid Solomon came to Florida to convalesce after a World War II injury. While visiting Sarasota, he decided to stay. Other artists like Helen Sawyer and her husband, portrait artist Jerry Farnsworth, moved here for health reasons as well. They built a home on Bay Island at the north end of Siesta Key. Lois Bartlett Tracy, one of the earliest women painters of abstract art, established a small artist retreat in Englewood. Photographer Joseph Steinmetz visited Sarasota in 1941 in hopes of restoring his son's poor health. The family stayed after the boy's quick recovery. For 20 years, he photographed the circus, the casual Florida lifestyle, and buildings designed by architects associated with the Sarasota School of Architecture. Steinmetz captured the 1950s lifestyle of Florida through his photography. The comfortable environment and quality of life caused a population boom in the late 1940s and 50s. More residential neighborhoods sprang up. In Venice, a new subdivision called South Venice opened. Farther east in 1959, the General Development Corporation created Northport, one of Florida's largest cities in geographical area. Residential lots were often sold to Northerners sight unseen for retirement or as an investment. As Northport grew, civic groups were organized, and banks, stores, and churches were built. Northport is now one of the fastest growing cities in the state. In the late 1950s, Northport was incorporated. At the same time, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus left its Sarasota winter quarters and within a few years moved to Venice. Residents enjoyed winter season shows and the attention the city received. Performers moved their families from Sarasota and called Venice home. The Clown College, an important part of the circus training program, was established in Venice in 1969 and remained in the community for 25 years. As a result of deteriorating railroad tracks, the circus left the area in 1992. After nearly 70 years in residence, the greatest show on earth pulled up stakes in Sarasota County. The Circus Museum that opened in 1948 at the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art continues to preserve circus history. 4 years later, in 1952, Cecil B. DeMille's movie, The Greatest Show on Earth, premiered at the Florida Theater, formerly known as the Edwards Theater. Filmed in Sarasota the previous year with thousands of extras, the movie won the Academy Award for Best Picture. The Sailor Circus began in 1949 as an extracurricular activity for Sarasota high school students. For over 50 years, young performers preserved the circus tradition through the greatest little show on earth. Art and culture have always been an important thread in the historical tapestry of Sarasota County. There is a permanent connection to the Native Americans, pioneers, and first families whose influences remain strong and evident today. Their hopes and dreams, triumphs and sacrifices made the communities of Sarasota County what they are today, unlike any other place in the state. It is up to us to build on the foundation laid by the early pioneers. Preservation is an ongoing process. The lasting benefits that result from the efforts of individuals, groups, and government agencies to protect structures and stabilize deteriorating neighborhoods cannot be underestimated.
Not only is it interesting to learn about the people that actually built the community, but there's, in Venice particularly, there's a built environment that today is still defining the way people relate to each other and to their community.
The people who were here in the 19s and in the 20s, those people are the foundation of Sarasota County. They built this place. They made it what it is today. It wasn't the people who came in and built the nice glass buildings, because way back then, if those roads hadn't been carved out and people hadn't worked hard on what they were doing, we wouldn't have this nice place now for people to enjoy. And we need to remember our foundation, and we need to honor it.
As we go back in our history, what we really find is that there are many voices and many cultures. The more we look into the past with real documentation, the more we discover that we have always been many people.
As a community of many voices, it is critical that we continue identifying important physical evidence of history and be proactive in pursuing a plan of action for protection. In doing so, we will remember our roots, find our place and relevance in history, then become enriched, empowered, and enlightened. Together, we can make an impact. Water, natural beauty, climate, opportunity, and now, culture. They are the ties that bind people throughout Sarasota County's history. As reflected in carefully preserved landmarks and natural areas, the legacy of past generations serves as a challenge to the present. To sustain a sense of place, foster a respect for heritage, and create lasting reflections for those who follow.
Want to learn more about our local history? Visit Historic Places. Join a historic organization. Get involved with programs that preserve our historic resources.
Seabirds fly high across our cloudless sky. The sun climbs high and everything's aglow. Just another day in pretty Sarasota, on the Gulf of Mexico. Dolphin play all along the Silver Bay. Flowers bloom and people say hello. Time just drifts away in pretty Sarasota, on the Gulf of Mexico. There's opera there and ballet there. There's classical music, theater, and jazz. There are displays almost every day, and circus razzmatazz. You know now I've been round, and I've seen the best of towns. But here's one town that just won't let you go. Nowhere can compare with pretty Sarasota, on the Gulf of Mexico. seat and drink some wine. Now's the time for nature's beauty show. God paints every sky and readies every soul.